of my most anticipated reads. This is just not the kind of trauma that I needed. This makes Finlay Donovan look like the equivalent of a Laffy Taffy rapper joke. This book, it is single-handedly the most devastating piece of literature I've ever read. What up, my channel? Welcome back to another video. I'm Jessie and you're watching. Hi, hello, welcome cuties. Today I am going to be doing a video that I'm really excited about. This is going to be me talking about all of the books that I have read in June. Now, I was literally just on FaceTime with my bestie Starla as I was getting ready to film this video, and they were like, yo, y'all are notorious for not uploading wrap-ups. I just felt so roasted, and I looked back over my notes. I have not filmed a single wrap-up since January. That is embarrassing. I am humiliated. Y'all, I am so sorry about the fact that I just am so bad at doing wrap-ups on this channel. But if you are new here and you've never seen one of my wrap-ups before, they go as follows. I get started by talking to y'all about my stats. I love statistics. They are such a good way for me to gauge my reading goals. It's also very pleasing. We have my gorgeous reading journal here. I love the stickers that I've decorated this with. This is Lilu from the Fifth Element. I have a Fifth Element tattoo. Of course, this is Sailor Moon and Sailor Mercury. Sailor Mercury over here, Sailor Jupiter. The Sailor Scouts are in the bottom too. If you want to see my little journal tour, I have a journal tour up on my Patreon, which is linked down below. But now we're gonna flip to June, to the June spread. We're going to get started by talking about what I intended to read for June and what I actually read. So those of you who've been here for a minute know that I have my TBR cards, which is a card game that helps me pick out my TBR every single month. For the ABC card, read a book that starts with the first letter of your first name. I selected Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell, which I did read. For the freshman card, start a new series. I selected Bluebird by C.L. Pierlet, which I did read. For the Nalo Hopkinson card, read a piece of Caribbean literature. I selected Here Comes the Sun by Nicole Dennis Benn, which I did read. For the R.F. Kuang card, read an Asian science fiction fantasy. I selected Kaikyi by Vaishnavi Patel, which I did read. For the Freedom card, read a book with a Jewish protagonist that is not set in wartime. I selected If You Come Softly by Jacqueline, which I did not read. In the month of June, I read a total of 11 books. 1 magical realism book, 2 fantasies, 2 thrillers, 0 nonfiction books, 1 science fiction book, 4 literature books, and 1 poetry book. 6 of these books I read physically, 5 I read audibly, 0 I read from the library, 7 out of 11 of the books that I read were by authors of color, 2 were on my long list, 1 was a highly anticipated release, and 1 was a DNF. My average star rating was 4.3. I read 63% authors of color and a total of 3,500 pages. Let us get started by talking about some of the books that I read for my TBR cards. We are going to get started by talking about one of my new favorite books of all time and my favorite book for the month. This is Just by Looking at Him by Ryan O'Connell, and it features a man who is a TV writer. He is definitely a functional alcoholic with his boyfriend Gus, and he lives with cerebral palsy, and he hates everything about his life. His boss is absolutely insufferable. He is unhappy with his boyfriend, who is just oh so perfect, but he wants more. He wants some spice. And so he goes down a rabbit hole of drugs, alcohol, and sex workers. And throughout this very messy, wild process, he is grappling with things like his disability, his self-image, and his own worth, and what's going to make him happy. Now, this is the single-handedly funniest book I have ever read in my life. I thought Finlay Donovan was funny. This makes Finlay Donovan look like the equivalent of a Laffy Taffy rapper joke. It is so funny. I was in stitches. If you want a book that is going to dissect very important critical themes like disability and self-image and how things like disability and queerness impact the way that you move through the world, your relationships, while also having a laugh out loud riotous ride, this is the book for you. Another thing that I really loved about Ryan O'Connell's writing was that it puts you right into the story. It doesn't feel like it's funny for the sake of trying to be funny. It's just so organic. Everything about our main character felt real. I felt like I knew him and that we were best friends. I also saw a lot of myself in this character and the ways that he grieves, the ways that He thinks that he's not good enough. At the end of the day, it's about the voices in our head, which ones we listen to and which ones we don't, and how much we allow our insecurities to drive us. I loved everything about this book. I haven't annotated the finished copy, but I annotated my arc, and I want to go through and re-annotate because I'm telling you, this book is special. There is grief, there is pain, there's love, there's joy, there's celebration, there is just, it's everything. 5 out of 5 stars. Absolutely my favorite book of the month. Now let us discuss Bluebird. So I also read this for Sapphic-a-thon, my monthly Sapphic readathon that I co-host with my best friend Jan. This month's Sapphic-a-thon details is going to be linked down below. I believe it's on the 23rd. It starts midnight to midnight. It's a 24-hour situation, and I'm really excited. I'm also going to be vlogging for Sapphic-a-thon for the first time in a while, and this month marks the 1-year anniversary that Jan and I have been doing Sapphic-a-thon, which is just so exciting. So I freaking can't wait. Bluebird is a science fiction novel where we are following a gunslinger outlaw named Rig. She created this weapon that the factions of the galaxy want to get their hands on, and after she creates it, she realizes that this weapon should not be in the hands of the powers that be. She steals the plans and goes on a mission to evade them, but that mission might cost her her life. And it's about the characters that she meets along the way. She teams up with this mercenary. She's got a heart of gold. She reminds me so much of River Tam, the kind of girl who can fight and dismember a man in seconds, but is actually a big softie at heart and is very innocent in the ways of the world. One of the things that I really loved about this book was it talked at such great lengths about patriotism, about when you want to be loyal to your empire, to your government, to the community that you were raised in, and the ideals and the values that you've been taught from day one, but you're also realizing that those ideals and values don't serve everybody. You're realizing that along the way, things are not exactly as they seem, and you are kind of getting the wool pulled over from your eyes. You're trying to decide who to be and how to move with that cloth lifted. And that is something that I really, really relate to. I think that that's something a lot of us can relate to, honestly, because we all grow, we all realize, or rather we should be realizing at many points throughout our lives that we've been lied to in different ways. And it's about how you're going to move once you realize those lies, once you see them, and the ethics of all of that. So I really enjoyed the politics. I enjoyed the world building as well. There's 3 factions that kind of govern the universe, and they're all corrupt in different ways, but they also are all known for different things. I also love that you have alien races. Like, our main character has blue skin, which I think is pretty damn cool, and it all just works so seamlessly. This is a science fiction book that I definitely believed in. It seemed like something that could actually happen somewhere. You know what I mean? You know how sometimes you are reading a book and you're like, yes, this very much feels like a fiction book, and other times you're reading a fiction book where you just believe in the story no matter what the hell is happening. And both kinds of stories are valid and enjoyable for me, but this was nice because I really, really believed in these characters, and I really liked them. The sapphic relationship is cute. The main character is in love with the librarian, and we love a sexy librarian character. Also, it's really funny. So if you like your science fiction books that have comedy in them, but comedy that's actually gonna make you laugh, this is it. I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars, and I'm not gonna lie, I did go into this having low expectations just because I didn't know anything really about this book. The publisher sent it, and I was like, yeah, absolutely, let's go, and it did not disappoint. Next up, we have another of my just absolute favorite books of all time, and this is a book that warred with Just by Looking at Him for the #1 spot. The reading experience for this book is incredibly vivid, and that is none other than Here Comes the Sun by Nicole Dennis Benn. This is an amazing, phenomenal story where we are following 3 women, mainly Margot and her younger sister. Margot is a sex worker who operates a hotel, and essentially she is working at this hotel to put her sister through medical school, but her sister just wants to be an artist. They live in Jamaica. Margot decides that she is going to basically turn the hotel into a brothel and get the whole family rich while not telling anybody. This book... First of all, this is one of the saddest books I've ever read.
All of the trigger warnings.
Look at me. Every single trigger warning that you could possibly imagine is in this book. There were times when I threw this book. There were times where just tears were at the tips of my the tears were at my eye ducts, and I was like, suck it up, Jessie, you suck that shit up. I refuse to cry over this book. It is single-handedly the most devastating piece of literature I've ever read. This is also a book that I read for Sapphic-a-thon and Queer Blackathon. When I'm telling you that this is one of the most beautiful, painful stories that have ever been crafted, like, I do not trust this author. I do not trust Nicole Dennis Benn, because this was like, this entire reading experience was the equivalent of reading chapter 23 from The Poppy War. It was just that. For the whole book. It was that sad. It was that traumatic. The writing was unbelievable. The writing was unbelievably gorgeous. It's so amazing. This is one of my favorite books of all time, and the sapphic relationships were very, very enjoyable. There's some really steamy scenes. There are some tender moments. There is a really deep exploration of ancestral trauma, of generational trauma, and the ways that we pass that shit down, the ways that we choose to either reject our trauma and work on it or become it. And that essentially is what the book is about. It's about abuse and the ways that we internalize it and how to break that cycle, and all of the little choices we make along the way that become who we are. So much moral ambiguity in this book. I don't know how not everybody is reading it. Patsy was Nicole Dennis Benn's sophomore novel, which I read, and y'all know that I absolutely love Patsy. Like, those of you who have been here for a while know that Patsy is one of my favorite books of all time, and that book was devastatingly sad. This makes Patsy look like a Dora the Explorer episode. I literally was reading this book in utter awe as to how someone could come up with something this fucking sad. 5 out of 5 stars. We also read Kai Kigi for the TBR cards prompt of reading a book with an Asian, reading an Asian science fiction fantasy book.
Why did I whisper that like the Yin Yang twins?
Kai Kigi, as y'all know, like, first of all, this book of the month edition, she's giving. She's, as y'all know, Kai Kigi is absolutely everywhere. Everybody wants to be her. Everybody wants to read her. Everybody is thriving. I actually read this for an experiment video as well. Therefore, I'm not going to talk about it too much because the video isn't out yet. I did very much enjoy the story, and if you are not in the know about Kaiki, a vilified mythological queen named Kaiki, who is known for having banished her god son. As she starts as a young woman with absolutely no power in society, she's married off at a young age against her will into this kingdom whose politics she is not familiar with people that she does not like nor respect, and essentially it's about how she uses her abilities to manipulate in order to come to power in the palace. One of the things that I really loved about Kaiki was her magical ability. She has these threads that allows her to manipulate other people. But in order to do that, you have to have a relationship with this person. You have to build a bond, and the stronger the bond, the easier it is for Kaiki to manipulate. And she's able to kind of go into this plane where once she's there, she can see all of these threads that exist and manipulate them within this plane, if that makes sense. I loved that component of the story. I love kind of puppet master magic and those kinds of characters. I find them psychologically really interesting. The ability itself I find very, very interesting. One of the things I also loved was how vast the character list was. There were so many characters, big gods, small gods, humans, and they all fit so seamlessly together. Reading this book was like a beautifully crafted dance, and it makes sense that there's tons of characters because this is mythology, but the mythology itself was so rich, the magic was interesting, and the lore behind these characters, the lore behind these gods and what they could do was brilliant. This book interested me in a way that Greek mythology simply never has. These gods interest me in ways that Greek mythology simply never has, and I definitely want to read more. I am so impressed. One of the things that I really, really loved was that you have a lot of dialogue about feminism and what what feminism looks like when women are just coming into their power and having to maneuver around men and be underground about their feminism. And I really loved the way that that was handled. I also liked that you had a relationship where a man was married to multiple women, and those women loved each other and cared about each other and uplifted and respected each other, instead of it becoming this clamor for power and trying to be like the number one wife. It was a lot of symbiosis with women. women throughout the book, where women weren't each other's enemies, where there wasn't femphobia. That was fantastic, because so often in fantasy books where a man has multiple wives, you do see it become this, okay, well, I want to be the queen bee situation, and it just wasn't like that. And I really, really enjoyed it so much about this book, and obviously I'm going to talk about it more in my experiment video, but I will say I enjoyed it. Now let's talk really briefly about our DNF, which was If You Come Softly by Jacqueline Woodson. This is a book that I've been trying to read for years. First of all, this cover, this edition is so beautiful. This is the signed 20th anniversary edition. This is like one of the most famous YA books of all time. It, I think, is the book that made Jacqueline Woodson so well known. Correct me if I'm wrong. And shockingly, I haven't read as many of Jacqueline Woodson's books as one would think. This is the story of a white Jewish girl falling in love with a black boy, a black non-Jewish boy. And it is set in the 1990s, so it's historical fiction, which feels really, really fucking weird to say.
We hate that.
We hate that 90s is considered historical fiction, but we're just gonna move on. And so it's about the struggles of being in this interracial relationship when there's not approval for it, as well as a religious component. The writing is simply beautiful. It just reaches out and slaps you in the mouth, and I got 50 pages into this book and it is stunning, but the problem with it is that I am not in the mood for a YA romance, and so I had to put the book down. I think the only way I'm gonna actually read this book is if I read a bunch of horror, I read a bunch of fucked up shit, and then I'm like, okay, now I need a break. Now I need something light and fluffy, and then I will read this. I just need to stop trying to force myself to read this book. So this is going to be a DNF, and it's not at all because of the author, it's not because of the writing, it's not because of any of that. It's simply because of where I'm at in my reading interests right now. I'm interested in adult fantasy, I'm interested in horror and thrillers and gay shit. Let us talk about Don't Cry For Me by Daniel Black. This is a book that I was actually quite nervous about. Don't Cry For Me is about a black father who is dying of cancer, and he decides to begin writing letters of confession to his gay son that he estranged and abused throughout his life. So obviously, this is a premise that is very sensitive. Yes, I have issues with this kind of premise. As a queer person, as a black queer person, I have issues with the idea that you are going to abuse your child throughout their life and reject and not accept them. Then towards the end of your life, when you realize that you're wrong, you're going to try and make up for that. Do not think that I'm saying that parents can't make mistakes and that if you mess up in this way, you shouldn't do everything in your power to make it right, because you absolutely should. It's just a premise, though, that I don't feel particularly inclined to read, if that makes sense. I'm also not the audience for this. This kind of book is for parents in these positions, right? Parents who have things to learn. Does this make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining this well. What I would get out of any book with this kind of premise, I've already learned through life, if that makes sense. And I don't need to read it. I would much rather just read books about queer people being loved and accepted and going on adventures and being the protagonist. And this is just not the kind of trauma that I need in my life personally. It was June, it was Queer Blackathon, and I wanted to make sure that I was reading a black gay male narrative. That was really important to me, and it was on my shelf, so I was like,
why not give it a try?
I read the audiobook on Scribd. Author reads the audiobook and he did a phenomenal job. The foreword is also absolutely brilliant. He talks about how this is a semi-autobiographical story. It's essentially his story, and it's felt. It is felt. I highly recommend the audiobook if you are able to listen to audiobooks. There's really not too much that I can say. The writing was beautiful. The father was dying of cancer, and he came around to realizing his son was a human being. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's not much I can say for the premise, but I will say I enjoyed the book and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars despite myself. You guys, next up I had a poetry moment. It has been such a long time since I've read poetry. That's not true. I read Don't Call Us Dead by Dennis Smith, who's a local poet. That is amazing. And I was just like in the middle of Blackathon, and you know how sometimes you're reading these books, you're reading these big books. As y'all saw, the books that I've been reading in June were, and if they weren't hefty in terms of thickness, they were hefty in terms of subject matter. And so I wanted to have a win, as in I wanted to pick something up and breeze through it. And so I decided to pick up my copy of Broken Halves of a Milky Sun by Ayu Nin. I could be saying their name incorrectly, but this is a poetry collection with an absolutely beautiful cover. The publisher sent that to me in February and I did not get to it. I do want to be a little bit better about picking up poetry books just because they allow me to be more introspective, and that is always a good thing, right? Especially because the book that I'm writing right now is very lyrical and poetry just always really helps me slip into that lyrical skin. This poet's history is really, really interesting. So this is their debut. They are an Angolan poet and artist, and they live in Poland. Unrelated, like this doesn't matter, but I also think that they are absolutely stunning. Like, can you imagine being this attractive? What? It's amazing. They're a painter, they're a mixed media artist, as well as a writer. I would love to sit and talk with this author about their experiences and the way that they move through the world and just all of that. Like, I really, 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 really want to be friends with them. Bad. But let's talk about the poetry collection itself. This was a poetry collection that was full of rage. It is very on the nose, so if you are a person who likes a little bit more metaphor in their poetry and to be able to sit and like really dissect, then you probably won't like this. This was not a poetry collection where you had to be like, what did the author mean? Literally lines where the author is like, yeah, fuck racism. I do tend to prefer poetry that is less on the nose. That being said, I still appreciated getting to read a poetry collection from a Black author that was so raw, where the Black author was just allowed to say what they wanted to say. There was a really good balance between poems that were just like very on the nose and very much not so. And I loved this line, "We're all serpents in the grass, too true to stay stuck in time mourning the past." This is what I mean by very on the nose. Activist spaces littered with non-Black people of color who have not reckoned with their internalized white supremacy and silenced the shit out of Black people are as good as used condoms at a skinhead barbecue. I gave it 4 stars. Next up, we have a book that made it onto my disappointing reads of 2022 video, which I will leave linked down below. And that is none other than Under the Udala Trees by Chinelo Okparanta. This was our Patreon buddy pick for for June. This is what we read in June for my Patreon with my
What is going on?
So this month we're reading Heir to the Moon, and this is what we read last month. And Under the Udala Trees tells the story of Ifeoma. What's her name? Under the Udala Trees tells the story of Ijeoma as she comes of age in war-torn Nigeria, realizing that she is a girl who likes girls. This is a book where she is reckoning with her religion, with her mother's attitudes towards queerness, with her own trauma, and falling in love. It is a book that is very rife with trauma and pain. It is very heavy. It is very, very heavy. So many of us in the Discord were constantly taking breaks throughout this book because we needed to practice self-care, and a bunch of us DNF'd it. We have a Discord chat where we talk about the book as we read it, and I was one of those people that was just really unsettled by the violence, but that's the point, you're supposed to be unsettled. Now, my issue with the book lies in the fact that if I am going to be reading a narrative that is very heavy, that is very rife with violence, I have to care about the character. I have to care about the character and what is happening to them. I have to have a connection in order to kind of make me reading the violence worth it. Unfortunately, I did not connect with the character. I didn't care what was happening. I didn't care what was happening in the story because the writing itself keeps you at a distance, and that is a very intentional choice. But unfortunately, because of the nature of this novel, that didn't work for me. I ended up rating Under the Udala Trees 4 stars simply because of the brilliant themes. The writing is very strong. It is gorgeous. It is, as far as literature goes, it's a perfect novel. In terms of its impact on me and my enjoyment of the reading experience, it was definitely 3 stars. To be frank, I was bored a lot of the time. But there is this line that haunts me. She is writing a letter to this girl. "All the things the boy will do, I promise to do better. In all the ways he can love you, I promise to love you better."
Literally can't breathe.
It's just so beautiful. So there's a lot to be said about this book. There's a lot of good. I do recommend looking up triggers. Unfortunately, it just wasn't exactly the book for me. Like I said, I would have given it a 3, but the writing itself, this book is a piece of literature, is definitely a 5-star read, so I settled with a 4. Then we have one of my most anticipated reads, like literally of all time, and that is Fevered Star by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the one anticipated book that I was able to get to in June, and this is the sequel to Black Sun. If you can see behind me, I have those books on display because that is how much I love this series. If you are not familiar with Black Sun, this is a trilogy by Black and Indigenous author Rebecca Roanhorse. It is set in the pre-colonial Americas, and we are following a cast of characters as they reckon with the awakening of a crow god. We are following a sun priest, we are following an assassin, we are following a siren, and we are following the crow god in the making as he moves from a young boy who is essentially from a cult and into godhood. This series is amazing. I love the writing, I love the world building, I love the pacing, I love everything about this series. I love the characters. The god character, Serapio, is chef's kiss. He is one of my favorite characters of all time. He is weird and quiet and pensive and violent when he needs to be, but at his core, it's not who he wants to be. But he was born for this very awful purpose, and he is set upon carrying it out. He is set upon the path. There's so much that I want to say about this book, but I'm going to stop there because I'm reading this. I'm actually reading both this and Hide for a video where I read the most hated books on booktube of 2022. That video is almost done. It is almost done. I'm fine talking about it because it's going to be out really soon. The last book that I'm reading for that vlog is what is it called? It's The Book of Night by Holly Black. I've also read An Honest Lie, which is included in these statistics. So I read Hide, Fevered Star, and Honest Lie in the month of June for that video, and I'm not really going to be talking about these books any further than that because I don't want to spoil that worst books video. Hide is the horror book that I read this month, and I'm not going to talk about it, but it is set in an amusement park, and it follows a cast of, I think it's 14 people, and they are trapped in this amusement park for 9 days, and if they can survive, the winner wins $50,000. So that's the premise, and every time I pick up this book, I have to shout out the map. Look at this map, it's so cool. Now I have to see if that was everything. So we have Bluebird, Here Comes the Sun, Just by Looking at Him, Kaiki, If You Come Softly, Under the Udala Trees, Lake Lore we didn't get to. Okay, so the very last book that we are going to be talking about is Lake Lore. Lake Lore was my very first novel by A.M. Miclemore, and it did not disappoint. In Lake Lore, we are following two non-binary teens as they delve into this magical water underneath the lake. It is a really beautiful story that is full of lyrical and poignant writing. I highly recommend the audiobook because the story just came to life through the mouth of the narrator. These characters were so well realized. One of my favorite things about the book was the way that it talked about neurodiversity and moving through the world as a neurodivergent individual. It also talked about mental illness and anxiety in a way that was so relatable and understandable. It talked about what it means to be Latin and to be non-binary and to be neuroatypical and to feel like you're too much, like you're taking up too much space. I really related to that struggle as somebody who is Afro-Latin and neurodivergent as well, and does struggle with that feeling of checking too many boxes, of taking up too much space, of wanting too much, of being too difficult, of having too many identities. That really spoke to me. And it really made me want to read all of their books because it just was absolutely phenomenal. This was the non-binary book club pick for June. If you are new here, I have a book club called NB Book Club, where every single month we read a book by a non-binary, two-spirit, spirit-selved, etc. spectrum author. Lake Lore was the book that was voted for June. This month's book is going to be The Lesbiana's Guide to Catholic School by Sonora Reyes, and we're really, really excited for that discussion at the end of the month with Kim from Native Lady Book Warrior. Audrey of Perpetual Pages was our guest host for NB Book Club in the month of June, so that live show with them is linked down below. The majority of it is spoiler-free, and then spoilers are at the end, and we give you a warning. So if you want my full thoughts on Lake Lore, definitely check out that video. It's linked down below, like I said, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So that's it, folks. That is the June wrap-up. I cannot believe that I finally ripped the band-aid off and did a frickin' wrap-up. What was your favorite book that you read in June? Did you do Queer Blackathon? Did you do Sapphicathon? If you want more content from me, I do have a Patreon where I make content exclusively for my patrons. This month's patron dedicated video is me talking about unpopular books that I want to read. And starting in the month of August, we are going to be doing a watch-along that is going to run for 3 months for the TV show American Gods. That is going to be happening with the top tier patrons because they have Discord access, and we're going to be discussing the show every week on Discord. So if you're interested in that, if you've been wanting to watch the show, definitely subscribe to the Patreon and watch it with us. We also have a reading sprint in 2 days on the 14th with the bestie Jan of Jan Agaton. So we're just doing fun stuff there, and there's way more perks that I haven't mentioned too. But all my social media links are in the description box below if you want to stalk me anywhere else. Till next time, stay safe, be good to yourselves, be good to others, and I can't wait to see you in my next video.